Ladies and gentlemen, I think we should make a start. For many of you, welcome back. For those of you who weren't here yesterday, welcome. I suspect that for many of us, those of us who were at the reception and dinner, this is the morning after the night before. So before you think you're suffering from some strange form of déjà vu or hangover-induced flashback, this is actually me going through the same announcements that I went through yesterday morning, but for the benefit of those who are new here. We're not expecting to test the fire alarms this morning, so if the fire alarms do go off, follow the directions of the staff who will direct you out of the fire exits at the back and at the front here to the fire assembly point, which is by the Barbara Hepworth sculpture. Don't turn your mobile phones off, because we want you to tweet, and we want you to tweet using the hashtag that's on the screen behind our speakers, Churchill at War. But do turn your mobile phones to silent, please. As with yesterday, we are recording, and it is our intention to put these proceedings up on the Archive Centre website within the next few days. So if you don't want to be on camera, make sure you're sitting towards the back of the lecture theatre, and I'm afraid don't ask a question, because if you ask a question, you will certainly be caught on film. We finished today expecting to finish today at round about 1:15, and at that point, lunch is available in college. For our speakers, we will be providing a complimentary lunch. For others who want to stay, you can pay as you go through the college tills. So yesterday we discussed what we could learn from the past and how we are working in the present. And today, after the break, we will be turning our attention to the future. But before that, having discussed yesterday why we fight, we now want to shift the emphasis and to look in this next panel at how we end conflicts. And I'm delighted to say that to chair this session, we have a very safe and experienced pair of hands, a great friend of the Churchill Archive Centre and of Churchill College, David Howarth, Professor of Law and Public Policy here at the University of Cambridge, a Fellow of Clare College, and of course, formerly MP for Cambridge. David.
Well, thank you, Alan. I didn't realise this session was going to be so risky to require a safe pair of hands. The title of the session is How Do We End Conflict? But I think it also includes how do we prevent future conflicts, and especially how do we prevent old conflicts breaking out again. And we have three highly qualified speakers who are going to take up that topic. We're going to start with Justine Huxley, who's the director of the St Ethelburga Centre for Reconciliation and Peace in London. And that centre concentrates mainly on helping individuals not only reconcile themselves to situations, but also to become the peacemakers of the future. Then we're going to hear from Alice Musabende, who trained as a journalist, she tells me, and is now a PhD student here in Cambridge. Alice comes originally from Rwanda, where she lived through and escaped from the awful events there, and then I think went to Canada, and now here as a Gates Scholar. And then finally, Paul Rogers, who needs no introduction, Emeritus Professor of Peace Studies at Bradford. But you'll remember that yesterday, when he asked a question, he reminded us that he was from the hard end of peace studies. And he's written most recently on ISIL and is going to be talking about that topic, but mainly with an emphasis on preventing future conflicts rather than what to do about the present situation. So without any more ado, can I ask Justine to start? Justine has some slides. And so she's going to talk, I think, from over there. Or
I'm going to stay here.
You can stay here, and the slides will magically move.
They will magically move. Thank you, David. Thank you for inviting me. And it's a huge pleasure to be here. Is this microphone working okay? Yeah. and a great pleasure to be with on the same panel as Alice and Paul, who've both got an incredible amount of experience and wisdom. So I'm coming from quite a different perspective. As David said, we're more of a grassroots organisation that work with community building. So I'm bringing a slightly different perspective to the table, but I hope it will be valuable for you. So I'm interested in this question of how we prevent war and how we prevent conflict. And I'd just like to offer you, just for a brief moment, I'd just like to offer the question back to you. So how do you think we should prevent war? And if we were to take responsibility for that, what do you think your part in that could be or would be? So from where I stand, the way to end conflict is really to build a culture of peace. And what does that really mean? I mean, they're nice words, but somehow they don't have quite the same power as an image of somebody carrying a machine gun. So what does it mean to build a global culture of peace? And is it even possible? Well, I believe it is, and I think one of the things that it depends on is people working together and people working across different sectors and disciplines. So for peace to become a reality, everybody in society needs to take responsibility for that aim. And that means the world of politics and the world of international relations, but also the world of economics, the world of ecology, food production, journalism, and I guess, Alice, you'd know very well the power of journalists to either fuel conflict or heal it. It would also involve educators, the arts, civil society, faith communities, and there'd also be the world of psychology in there, because how we are as individuals and how we think as individuals is also important. So to achieve a global culture of peace, everybody needs to work together and everyone in society needs to make that happen. I think the second thing that's needed to achieve that aim is really to address root causes. So conflict transformation is really a sticking plaster. It's about patching up the messes that we create. Whereas if we want to build global peace, we have to look at the root causes. And one of the major root causes, of course, is economic injustice. And so we're really living in a world that's built on greed and built on competition and built on market forces. And we're kind of taught to see market forces as like a natural law. But really there's an assumption in there that, you know, we've built a system that works on competition, but can we build a system that works on cooperation? And there are lots of indications that actually we can, coming from the grassroots up. If you look at the initiatives in the world of new economic models, you'll find different models of ownership that involve sharing resources. You'll see new economic activity based on social enterprise, which may seem small, but actually has tremendous transformative potential. And you'll see models of sharing economies and alternative finance. And these things at the moment are mostly small grassroots, and how they topple the world of corporate greed, I don't know. But they are showing us a different way, and it's important to notice that. So I think also at the level of root causes, we need to look at our relationship with the earth, because we will never have peace without environmental justice. And climate change and resource depletion has been fueling conflict and migration around the world for a while. It continues to exacerbate and generate conflict, and that will only increase in the next 50 years. So we really need to look at that. And as a Lakota elder said to me recently, we work with a beautiful Lakota indigenous teacher called Tiokasin on one of our leadership programs. And he said to me a couple of weeks ago, there will never be peace on earth. And that phrase just points towards the Western mindset and language of domination. He said, there will never be peace on earth. There will only ever be peace with earth. And there's also something in that quote that leads me to my next point, that root causes includes the way we think as human beings. Oh, I'll come to that in a sec. So we're conditioned to think in terms of dualism and binary choices. And this is really behind, or it's one of the factors behind our habit or our need to respond to threat with military action or with military force. So this is like we have a view of self and other, and that sense of self and other generates a sense of threat that is responded to in this particular way. But from a systems thinking perspective, we're part of a web of relationships across the world, in a system. And that's a very different way of looking at our relationship with other human beings and also other non-human beings. So, and also this is present in the world of psychology. If you apply a systems thinking mode to psychology, then you see that actually victim and perpetrator both exist within us. So changing the way we think is really important. And in lots of different communities, this is being called a paradigm shift. So it would be great if there was a shift key like that. So this paradigm shift, what is it? I mean, I would say that it's about moving from dualistic thinking to interdependent thinking. So when we put peace, ecology, and economics together, then we're working in an interdependent way. And when we move from mechanistic worldview to a systems worldview, that's a paradigm shift. And when we move from hierarchies to networks. And so these are present in new economic models, they're present in ecological initiatives, and they're present when we work together in an interdisciplinary way. And sometimes when we talk about paradigm shift, I feel that that makes more sense to the younger generation because something's been embedded in the consciousness of the younger generation that's to do with interconnectedness. So that paradigm shift can be seen generationally as well. So just coming back to our culture of peace, from one perspective you could say that a major barrier to building a culture of peace globally is this problem of dualistic thinking, of these forced choices that we have to make between this and that. And if you take the referendum as an example, so we were offered leave or remain. We were forced into a binary choice around that. But that way of thinking is very outdated. It can't deal with the kind of complexity that we're facing on a global level. And forced choices limit creativity, they limit innovation, and they fuel division. And so debate, in a way, is a forced choice between this and that, whereas dialogue is a more interdependent, complex way of operating. So what if, rather than a referendum, we'd put all of the energy that went into kind of fueling that very polarizing, demonizing debate, if all of that energy had gone into large-scale participatory dialogue that asked questions such as, what's the ideal relationship between the UK and Europe? You would have got a very different result, and something much more innovative could have come out of that. So I think it's what Brexit and Trump have done is they've shown us that the political system doesn't work, and it's those binary choices that are behind that. So that system, how you change that system, I have no idea, but it's clear that it's broken and it needs to change. Can you tell me when I've got a couple of minutes left?
1 minute left.
1 minute left, oh my God, okay. Well, I was going to present some other ideas about this shift from interdependent from binary to interdependent. I'll just mention one of them is restorative justice. So if we have a justice system that's based on right or wrong, or on guilty or not guilty, and based on punishment rather than restoration, that's part of the same way of thinking. But actually restorative justice is infinitely more subtle, interconnected, can deal with complexity and deals with it through relationship and is much more nuanced. And there is tremendous potential in restorative justice. So I've just got, that's about interdependence. And this is a kind of model that St. Ethelburgus has created about that interdependent thinking flowing into these different sectors of society and then working together towards sustainable peace. So that's too complicated to talk about now. But at St Ethelburgers, we always like to finish our conversations with invitations to action, because if we are to build a global culture of peace, every one of us has to be part of that. So this question that, what can I do to be part of a global culture of peace? So I've got some suggestions for you that tap into what I've just been saying. So firstly, reject dualistic choices. Don't be forced into choosing between A and B. If you're given an option between A and B, choose C. Look at restorative justice, experience it, look at how you can implement it in your own communities. Explore new economic work, support new economic activity in your community. Go to transition towns, like support local social enterprise. Divest from fossil fuels, so change your energy supply and move your money from high street banks to ethical banks. High street banks are driving economic injustice and climate change. And own your own psychology, explore your own shadow, integrate the victim and perpetrator inside you. Fantastic book, free on the internet. It's called Integrate Your Shadow, Master Your Path. If Donald Trump read this, we could all breathe a sigh of relief. If you're thinking of a career in politics, read it twice. Go and volunteer in a refugee camp in Europe. Experience that crisis and that suffering firsthand, and sit down and talk to refugees, listen to their stories, and understand that actually we're all in this together. And finally, if you can't think of anything else to do, you could come and visit us at St Ethelburgers, because we run leadership programs and trainings that incorporate all of these ideas and bring them into social action projects. We're only an hour away, so come and visit. Thank you.
So thank you, Justine, for that. You weren't here yesterday when Nick Horton started the whole conference off with a Hobbesian vision, and that was the opposite. And so that's a very important contrast. Now, Alice.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm very honored to be here today. Thanks for inviting me. I speak from two different perspectives. I speak today as a scholar of post-conflict and peace building and post-conflict reconstruction, but I also speak, I think, mostly as a genocide survivor. A lot of what I have studied over the last, and what I have done over the last 20 years, I think, since the end of the Rwandan genocide against the Tutsis, has been sort of inspired by those personal experiences. So I got interested in understanding how people rebuild countries because I was living in one. I was too young at the time and I didn't know. I just know that I was quite angry at how things were. I was a teenager. And with time, I came to understand that there were different ways to rebuild a country. I don't really know if there is one way that one helps to rebuild a country. I think there is a huge range. And I know now, after having studied politics for quite a while, that I wasn't the only one who was thinking about what to do when the war ends. The international community, this is a question that the international community has been grappling with, at least for the last, openly anyway, for the last 50 to 60 years. At the end of the Cold War, and mostly with the wars on the African continent in the 1980s and 1990s, the United Nations in particular, the United Nations was grappling with this. What do we do when we help countries, if we help countries end a war? How then do we help them rebuild their countries? The experiences in Somalia, in Rwanda, in Burundi, sort of through the entire community, really the entire international community, off balance for the longest time, struggling to understand what is it that we as an international community can do to alleviate these countries and to prevent them from relapsing into conflict. Because studies had shown and have been showing that almost all the countries that come out of war, sign peace accords, end up falling back into conflict some two decades or so later. So how do we help countries not fall back? So the discussions that we have had since yesterday here, both on the questions of what is war today and what should we learn from history, as well as the strategic and operational realities of wars that we have today, point to one specifically and very crucial point about thinking about what happens when war ends. What I am going to speak about today is not so much what to do on an individual level, but what the international community has tried to do over the last 2 decades. And what they've tried to do is something that they have named international peace building. International peace building was the solution that the international community came up with in the mid-2000s to sort of come up with a paradigm, if I may use that word, to come up with a potential way that we can start thinking about how to help countries end wars and rebuild them. Primarily, this kind of international peace building has been both conceived and operationalized as an international endeavor. So it was supposed to be by the international community, whereby the international community, mainly through the UN and other international organizations, would take the task of rebuilding countries that have collapsed due to war and other conflicts and prevent them from relapsing into conflicts again. There is, however, a couple of issues with that idea. One of them is that the very nature of international peace building is about intervening in sovereign affairs of countries coming out of conflict. And it was a dilemma that even today we still have to deal with. The UN has had to deal with this in Bosnia, in Kosovo, in South Sudan, with a new country, with many other African countries. And the problem with the idea of international peace building is so much to do with the Western values that come with it, that are not always, almost always shared by the governing forces in these countries that emerge from conflicts. So there is a tension, an inherent tension, and a criticism that many scholars of international peace building have spoken about and tried to study how to get away from it. So it has become clear. In 2005, the United Nations decided to start the UN Peacebuilding Commission. The idea behind the Peacebuilding Commission, at least from the United Nations perspective, was to sort of come up with a place inside the United Nations where these ideas would come together and where countries who are coming out of conflict would find a niche to be listened to. The Commission was supposed to select a number of countries that are really in dear need of peace and reconstruction in an emergency sort of way and be on the agenda as a priority of the agenda of the United Nations, meaning of the member states of the United Nations. And the money was supposed to be, the funds would come from the rest of the international community, mostly international donors, the main donors, and then it would be channeled into rebuilding this country. In and of itself, it was a wonderful idea. It still sounds like a wonderful idea. The problem is, how do you put it into practice? There are so many tensions. One of them is the question of resistance, local resistance. Just because these countries come out of war and they need the international community does not mean that they will necessarily collaborate with the international community under the terms of the international community. And these sort of transmits, these tensions go all the way down to the consequences that then the local populations have to still suffer from. The other problem that is contentious in international peace building has to do with the transmission of Western values. Now, yesterday we had a discussion about Western values. No one really ever challenges the idea, well, some people probably do, but the idea of the rule of law, the idea of a democratic election. These are wonderful ideas. But I believe, and I think I have observed, that in many countries that come out of war, the conceptions of these ideas and values behind what we think as Western liberal ideas are not necessarily shared. What we think is peace building is not necessarily what someone thinks, I don't know, in some post-war capital somewhere in Africa. They probably think peace building, but we probably don't know exactly what they mean when they say peace building, and they don't know what we mean in the, when we come up with these ideas, what we really mean. Now, is it really a question of rhetorical discussion? I don't think so, because the lack of a shared meaning around these ideas really makes it so hard to operationalize them. Because if you mean peace building, and I mean peace building, but all I really say is, all I need is your money and I will go and do what I want to do, we really are not talking about the same thing. If we live in a country where the conception of what a civil society is different from what a civil society is in Western countries, then it's really hard to say that you are consolidating civil society in a country that's coming out of war. We live in a parallel universe where we, especially in peace building, we really have two different or even multiple definitions of how to rebuild a country, different from both people who come from wars and people who are trying to rebuild these countries. The other main issue, and I will end on these two notes, the other main problem is the lack of humility on the part of Western countries. Because these ideas are so entrenched, the rule of law, democracy, these big ideas are so entrenched into the lives and ways of thinking of Western thinkers, there is always this sense, and I think people who come from countries other than the West would probably back me here, I think that there is a sense of superiority that makes everyone else, and by this I'm generalizing, of course, that make them feel a little bit less than participants in their own developments. That these ideas are so superior that there is no space for anyone else's way of doing things. So we have seen a lot of resistance coming from different countries that are emerged from wars. There are challenging ideas that we hold so dear, near and dear here in the Western world. One of them is the rise, for example, of the International Criminal Court by many African countries now. We do joke about it as, they just don't want to have to face the law. But really, I think that there is another message. We may not agree with it, but I think that there is a message of resistance to these values, especially when they clash with other values. Now, is it a question of elites? I don't know. But there is something to think about. If we are thinking about moving ahead with helping countries rebuild themselves and stay consolidated, then it's very important that we figure out some sort of middle ground somewhere where we can listen to each other. My last point is one of my own research key. It's the centrality of the state. Now, when you say a state here and the state in a different part of the world, they really don't mean the same thing. But beyond that, in many post-conflict countries that have been through war, the state still holds such a major role. It decides what people do, how they do it, what policies come through, what issues that we do, how do we hold first elections, how do we not hold elections, how do we... And I think that because there is because peace builders and international peace building policy makers have a discomfort into holding most of these governments accountable because they want peace so much. They want stability. You don't want to keep moving things. They're there. They've won. We've had an election. Let's just cool down and not move them too much, even though they continue to not be accountable to their own people. Now, do we invent another kind of paradigm shift where we hold governments accountable? Do we even have the right to hold another government accountable if it's not our government? I mean, we are not the ones who elect people in South Sudan or in Burundi or in Rwanda. Should we have a word in what their governments do with or to their own people? I don't know. But I think that it's important to have this discussion, especially as we move into other kinds of wars, cyber wars, terrorism and counterinsurgency, and other issues that many post-conflict countries are actually particularly vulnerable to. as they try to rebuild themselves. So there is a balance to maintain, but also the necessity, I think, to think forward and to sort of figure out as soon as possible now how to help people in these nations, both their governments and the states that rule these countries, but also the grassroots. It's not one or the other. It has to happen at the same time and at the same level. And I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Much to think about there, but we're going to have questions at the end, so we're going to move straight on to Paul.
Thank you very much indeed. Is my voice okay at the back? Great. I can't help but remember a comment from a Ghanaian friend of mine 50 years ago in relation to what Alice was just saying towards the end of her talk. And he said rather impishly, he said, Paul, what was the reason that the sun never set on the British Empire? And I wasn't sure. He said, well, the reason was because God didn't trust the British in the dark. And in a sense, I think that feeds into Alice's point about Western attitudes. I want to start reflecting a little bit on the experience of the last 15 years with the War on Terror, but move on, in fact, very closely to some of the points that Justine was making, but looking at them maybe from the perspective of what I would call the control paradigm. Or to put it crudely, I've made one attempt to invent a word. It's got taken up a bit by Google, not very much, and that word is lidism. You keep the lid on things rather than going underneath and working out the problems. Let me start with a quote from a very experienced journalist, Owen Bennett-Jones of the BBC World Service. He reviewed 3 books on ISIL recently for the London Review of Books, and this is the final paragraph. The failure of Bush and Blair's war on terror is well established. The consequences of the failure are perhaps too little reflected on. After 15 years of conflict, there are now many places on earth where Westerners dare not tread, and Western politicians are reduced to defining victory as an absence of attacks at home. For the Khalif and his sympathizers, those are remarkable achievements. Before 9/11, the idea of establishing a caliphate would have been written off as a fantasy. Even if there are setbacks to come, the Khalif and his supporters believe that time is on their side. It's hard to disagree with one of the authors here who predicts that these wars will carry on for decades, however much military force the global elite deploys to maintain the status quo. The former US Defense Secretary Leon Panetta predicts 30 more years of conflict, which is another way of saying there is no end in sight. I think if we look back over the last 15 years, we're now into the 16th year of the War on Terror, and we're now into the 14th year, almost the 14th year of severe conflict in Iraq. You look back and think of occasions when it seemed to be working so well. George W. Bush's State of the Union address in January 2002, celebrating the apparent success in Afghanistan. 3 weeks after the statue of Saddam Hussein fell in that Baghdad square, he was able to give his mission accomplished speech from the flight deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln. And there again, things be going rather better. In both cases, they went rapidly downhill, but by the end of his second term, it looked like the Iraq insurgency was being contained and suppressed, and Obama was able to consider a withdrawal. Things seemed to be getting better, and this is even heightened by the killing of bin Laden in 2011. On all these occasions, it has just not proved out that way. And what we have now is an enduring and very difficult conflict. 6 months ago, the final attack on Sirte in northern Libya to dislodge the ISIS people there was started. 3 months later, the United States had to bring in air power because it wasn't working. 6 months later, as of this week, they are still entrenched in a part of the city. We're now into the 6th week of the attempt to liberate Mosul. The first 2.5 weeks seemed to go well. It is now thoroughly bogged down in the eastern approaches to the city. In other words, if you like, the attempts to control through the normal means are simply not working yet. One thing which strikes me very significantly, I think, is that over the last 2.5 years, we've had a very intense air war, a remote war using strike aircraft and drones against ISIS. In that time, the estimate from the Pentagon last January was that in the first year and a half, they had killed 26,000 ISIS supporters. The figure is now probably over 35,000, and yet ISIS appears to be able to resist an extremely large-scale force ranged against it. Ultimately, Mosul will fall and Sirte will fall. but it is not the end of the business one little bit. Let me put it another way. Since the Arab awakening of 5-6 years ago, there have been a number of changes in significant countries. One in particular, I think, people would say has made serious progress to more representative governance, and that, of course, is Tunisia. The Ben Ali regime went. In fact, the Muslim Brotherhood-linked party Ennahda made rather a hash of being in power, and gave up power to a coalition. Yet, Tunisia, of all the countries in the Middle East and North Africa, has proportionally more of its young people going to join extreme movements than any other. Part of the explanation is that within Tunisia, a country of 11 million people, you have about 140,000 unemployed graduates. You have a severe problem of marginalization on a very large scale. And unless we're addressing the underlying reasons why groups such as ISIS and Al-Qaeda can actually make progress and still attract recruits, we have to go down to those basic problems there. And I should say, incidentally, that while we think about Al-Qaeda now as something of the past, under Zawahiri, surprisingly, since bin Laden was killed, it has staged something of a comeback. Because, in fact, it is reaching out in the areas in which it has groups operating more to local cultures. So now Nusra, what we used to call Nusra, has changed its name recently, has actually been making progress in Syria, and it is linked to Al-Qaeda, not ISIL. So you have a complex situation in which we are not actually succeeding. But I'd actually like to argue much more widely, and this really connects with what Justine was saying. I think you should see the experience of the last 15 years, or in the case of Al-Qaeda, 25 years really, as really a marker for the kind of problems we will have in the future, which may actually have nothing to do with extreme Islam. In fact, I think what we're more likely to be moving into is not a clash of civilizations between a Christian West and an Islamic world, but an era of revolts from the margins. If you like, not a clash of civilizations, but an age of insurgencies. I mean, may well find that, in fact, the kind of marker to look at might well be the neo-Maoist Naxalites in India, who've been around for 20 years, caused the Indian government no end of problems. They're not being defeated, but they're not spreading, but they are there. Now, why does one think that we're moving into this period? And this fits in very much with what Justine was saying. The neoliberal economic model worldwide is not working. It's not fit for purpose. We thought it would work well. We've had patchy economic growth with some hiccups in Asia in the late 1990s and more recently in the Western world. But the reality is it may deliver growth. It is not succeeding in delivering economic justice or emancipation. And you have a problem of extraordinary divisions of wealth. And one talks about the 1%. The much more significant is the 20%. The fifth of the world's population, transnational, that have benefited so well from the last 40 years. And I would hazard a guess that all of us present in this hall are a part of that 1/5. But at the same time, while that has happened, you've had the extraordinary achievement worldwide of huge improvements in education, literacy, and communications. My first job many years ago, certainly nearly 50 years ago, was in Uganda, when at the time the government, pre-Amin, was trying to get as many kids as possible through 4 years of primary schooling. They were quite good on the gender gap as well, rarely. But at the same time, that was their aim. And there was one small university college, small but good, Makerere. You go back to Uganda now, you have, nearly a dozen universities. You have 3 times the population. But you have people aware of where they are in wider society. The older ones among us will remember a popular phrase 30 years ago in Britain, the revolution of rising expectations. We were basically in a country where there were rich and poor, but everybody was getting better. We've now moved worldwide into a revolution of frustrated expectations, and that is breaking out in all kinds of ways, in many ways across the global south. The problem is that the kind of economic system we have, and the one that Justine addressed and suggested alternatives, is essentially very heavily embedded. And there doesn't seem to be any real change in that on a macro scale. But, and this is the clincher, again, as she said, we're moving into the era of environmental limits to growth. Specifically climate disruption, I wouldn't call it climate change. We know that that is accelerating, and it is deeply asymmetric. It is asymmetrically affecting the Palearctic and the tropics and subtropics. And essentially, that means for the tropics and subtropics, probably some of the most important croplands in the world, supporting probably the majority of the world's population, the ecological carrying capacity of those lands is actually declining. We're beginning to see that. We're in the very early stages. The migratory pressures, which in fact Chris mentioned that DCDC had done a lot of work on, are already there, and they're added to by refugee flows from war-torn areas. But this is as nothing as the problems we get if climate change kicks in, or when it kicks in. So the problem is overall that on present trends, if we don't have a radical change in our paradigms, we're going to end up with what that ecologist Edwin Brooks, and former MP, said 45 years ago. He said the dystopic future we have to avoid was, quote, a crowded, glowering planet of massive inequalities of wealth, buttressed by stark force, yet endlessly threatened by desperate people in the global ghettos. And we're rather nearer that now than we were. It means that we now have to move into an era of pretty comprehensive rethinking about what we mean by security. And I think the biggest lesson of the last 15 years is that the control paradigm has failed and is failing, and I suspect will continue to fail. We've got to go beyond that to do some fairly serious rethinking. As Justine was saying, there's some very good work going on already. I mean, look at the work on economic transitions that the New Economics Foundation is doing. Look at the work that the Amadown conversation is doing on our thinking on security. There are many possibilities, but I think we're now in an era where if we start off looking at the nature of war, we're really into an uncharted territory. And I think over the next 20 to 30 years, we actually have to move towards a worldwide system which is intrinsically fairer and more sustainable. And the emphasis there is we have to. If we don't, we're going to end up with a kind of dystopia. But I will remind us, because in some ways this is very negative, now the majority of the world's people live in conditions of tolerable peace. It is by no means bad. In fact, if anything, the records tend to show there is rather less major violence now than 20 years ago. And you think back to the Great Lakes and the rest, and that puts it in perspective. Yet it is the future we're concerned with. And I would end with the suggestion that it's one interesting way of defining the term prophecy is that prophecy is suggesting the possible. And I think that is the period we're in now. It means there's a huge responsibility on think tanks, on university staff and others to actually think things through. If we don't, then I think we have a very difficult future. And my wife and I have 5 grandchildren aged between 6 months and 7 years. They could well be alive in the 22nd century. It would be nice for them to look back in the 26s and 70s and say the kind of thinking that went on in the 2020s actually ensured we did move to a more sustainable world. There's everything to play for, but the task is huge. Thank you.
So thanks. Questions? Can I just see where the microphones are? There they go. So could you just wait until the microphone arrives and remind us who you are, although we know who we are now. But, could we just start down there?
Well, I'm Chris Parry. I think you know who I am. What I get from all of you is that we have a global system right now where we have a global insurgency of what Paul called frustrated expectations. And that radical Islam simply is the vehicle for the expression of grievance and frustration at the system that keeps people in where they are. And if you take the microcosm that Alice mentioned in Rwanda, whereby essentially you have a resource conflict that then expresses itself, if you like, in tribal or racial terms, what we seem to have is a ragged borderline between privilege and grievance, where the transaction is beginning to be dominated by violence. And I think the question I'd like to ask is, as we have this new global insurgency and this ragged edge between the privileged and the not so privileged, and the transaction being mediated by violence, how do we actually exert some control over this so we don't all end up being consumed in the middle?
That kind of sounds like a psychological question, because I'm going to start with Justine.
I was thinking it sounded like a Paul kind of question.
No.
Like Lidism.
No. Lidism, yes.
I absolutely agree, Justin, with everything you say in moral terms. but I have lived in a world where I've seen the men and women of violence. You know, I've been alongside in Liberia, invited my sailors to pick up severed limbs. The transaction there is not one necessarily of cooperation. You have to confront evil where you find it. And I'm just wondering how we mediate this very violent, jagged edge, which is always symptomatic of transitional arrangements, whether it's national or global. Now, I've been in the position of, if you like, dealing with the symptoms of these crises. You know, how do we actually control the mechanism for actually transitioning?
Well, I don't know whether controlling the mechanism is the right phrase in the first instance. And I guess I would come at it from two different angles. I mean, the short answer is I don't know. And actually, I think it's incredibly important that human beings sit with the knowledge that we don't know. You know, there's something about, we recreate from the old paradigm when we think we know what we're doing. And it's actually, the whole planet is in the face of such a crisis. You know, we really need to actually acknowledge that we don't know how to do it. And then that opens up a space for a different kind of conversation. So that would be one point. The second point would be, I think from a if you did want to take it from a psychological perspective, my sense is that individually and personally, there can be no such thing as fulfillment, personal fulfillment, beyond becoming involved in the solution, becoming involved in that transition. So I think the time has gone where we can focus on our own individual lives and our own individual happiness. Like, we have to give what we have to be in service to that transition. And thirdly, I think it just comes back to economic injustice. I mean, that is the thing that we have ignored, and it's a lot of the time it's just the kind of elephant in the room. I mean, I think I was reading a story somewhere of someone who was at a conference about world poverty, staying in this massive 5-star hotel with kind of slums outside, and it's also, we've spent so much time working with, race equality, gender equality, religious equality, all of these things, and like, where is that work coming around the relationship between the privileged and the unprivileged? And I feel in my own life, I feel I've spent, 10 years, 15 years using the vehicle of interfaith work to try and build a kind of network that can help this shift to happen. And like, really the reason I landed in St. Ethelburgers was because I was convinced that faith communities had a role to play in that change and could stand for a different set of values and could stand for just working together in a different way. And I think that's no longer the case. I've been incredibly disappointed in the way faith communities have responded to what we're facing globally. But it does, for me, it comes back to this issue of how we respond to that economic injustice. And I think it's working with the marginalised and embracing the marginalised and doing individually whatever we can to actually to look at that and to embrace it and to, get our hands dirty and get involved in that. To me, that, I don't know what that looks like on a global level, but it's like we can't ignore it any longer.
Alice.
I'd like to add something, and I liked your question because it really says, what do we do when it's happening for real? Not when we have time to sit in a nice Cambridge place and talk about it, but what do we really do when it happens? And this is a question that I think, as a Rwandan genocide survivor, this question goes to the heart of what you're saying. When it was happening for real, for 100 days with hundreds and hundreds of people dying every day, we don't have time to talk about conflict transformation. And I mean this in a good way, really a respectful way. We don't have time. There is a need to act when children are dying. And I think I'm going to attempt an answer. You're an admiral. When you're there on the front line, perhaps the thing to do is to say, is this the best I can do? If you can say, is this the best I can do, then perhaps someone else can do the same, and perhaps someone else can do the same. And I'm saying this because you probably all know General Romeo Dallaire. He's a man I hold in high esteem because he tried to do what possibly is the toughest transaction anyone is ever forced to do, which is to negotiate with people who are killing people, how many people they can take and how many people he could save. And I think at that very moment, when he was looking at these killers, an entire structure, an institution of killers, of a government that was intent on literally decimating its own people, he had to make a choice. And at that moment, it just was, can you please let me take at least these ones, and the kids, and the women, and, you know, and these type of ways of thinking, I think, is what I mean by doing the best when you're faced with the situation. Now, today, it's not the genocide anymore, at least not in Rwanda, but there's so many other horrible things that are happening all over the place, in the DRC, in Sudan, in the Middle East. If we sit here, if every single one of us can say, you know, me studying issues of state is really the best I can do at this very moment to challenge the pain that people are going through, then we're doing the right thing. But if that's not what you're doing, then perhaps there is some soul searching that have to go on before we even sit as member states in the UN to talk about what to do as a global community. The question that I've lived in Canada now for about 12 years. Canada has had a very, very sad history with Aboriginal people, members of the First Nations. It's a horrifying history for such a grand country that I love very much. And over the last 6 or 7 years, we've talked about this question of Aboriginal women who die and disappear and get trafficked into prostitution all over the country. And every single time we talk about it, it's, you know, everyone feels the pain and everyone recognizes that it's a real issue. But it's quite rare that we see people come out in the street in the middle of the snow in January to march and go and ask the members of parliament that we elect every 4 years what they're actually doing. We do talk about it on television. We do interviews with members of the First Nations. It's all nice and very beautiful. But really, do we push? And when we are pushing because, you know, can we actually say that that's the best we can do? Or we've gotten into this comfortable situation where it's tolerable as long as it's not at your doorstep. It's sort of okay, I mean, people are dying, but it's really not in my house. What happens when it gets to your doorsteps? That's the question.
I think one of the things one has to appreciate is that when you get circumstances of what you might call the majority margins, in different circumstances, people may fall back on different aspects of their identity. It may be religious, it may be ethnic, it may be nationalistic, it may well be political. Broadly speaking, different forms of revolt, if you like, revolutionary movements, may have different bases. Al-Qaeda and ISIS are rather unusual in that they are rooted in one of the world's great religions, one of the 3 religions of the book, a very perverse version of it, but it means they have this eschatological dimension, which means their timescales may be measured in a century or more, not the 10 years or so that you would get in most revolutionary movements. And that makes them particularly difficult. But the issue is that while I acknowledge Chris's point, when you actually have the revolts developing with tremendous loss of life, then one has to have some sort of system to erect a degree of control and order. But that is not the long-term answer. Because I think unless you could have a system which is integrated into new thinking on how to prevent these roles developing, then I think basically we're really just doing symptom treatment and that's all. And, you know, just to go back, I think what Justine and I have both been saying, we have major global problems of an economic system which is failing at specifically the time when we're facing environmental limits. I mean, we're now starting to enter, hesitantly, the 3rd great human transition. The first was the agricultural revolution 8 to 10,000 years ago. The second was ongoing, it's the Industrial Revolution. The third is the transition to living within the means of the planet fairly. And we have not really thought that through. So while I acknowledge the need for specific things once the problems have developed, I have to say that the way we've done it in the last 15 years has been pretty dismal. But what's much more important, and it's the subject of this panel, is to look longer term at what you can do to prevent these problems developing in the future.
Great. Thank you. Other questions? There is one there. Let's look at further into the back.
Hello, I'm Tanya Brown. I'm a student here at Cambridge. I think it's really important what you were saying about the economic inequality. And I would say to you, Chris, that I've been a police officer and I've picked up severed limbs from a man that's chucked himself under a train. And he was a victim of economic inequality. I think male suicide is something that's very important. But sort of moving away from that point, I think my question is, in a time when this dystopia seems ever more likely with the rise of the alternative right, how do you think we get back on board with the ideals that you guys have put forward in opening conversations? And is it realistic to think that that's ever going to be possible with the way we're going now?
Shall we do this in reverse order, Paul?
Well, I suppose in a sense it has to be possible because the alternative is so worse. I mean, it's an extraordinary period at the moment. I mean, we can talk about the different kinds of revolts you get in the global south, not least the Middle East and North Africa. We can also talk about the upheavals in Western societies, where people basically are turning against what they perceive as an unfair process of globalization. I don't think it's a problem of globalization. I think it's a problem of the integration in globalization of a particular economic system. It's the two together that are the dangerous ones. And that reaction can include things like Trump. It can include also things like Syriza in Greece or Podemos in Spain. But it is, in a sense, a reaction. I think it's an extremely difficult nut to crack, getting to grips with the reasons why you'll get... It's an extraordinary phenomenon, and it's something that people have a real problem with. The idea of the majority margins. Put those two words together. You would never normally put them together. Put together majority margins. We're not dealing with the poor getting poorer. The bottom billion are still very badly off. But we're dealing with, maybe 4 to 5 billion people who relatively are not sharing, in their view, fairly with life chances. And within that, you're getting all kinds of problems breaking out in different ways. We actually have to address it ultimately at cause. Justine was talking a little bit about it. There are other models. We tend to forget 950 million people worldwide are members of cooperatives and mutuals. There are different systems, but we have to accept that we are engaged in a transition which has to be done, however difficult that may seem to be. And if we don't do it, then, my grandchildren are going to have some pretty rough old ages, which I'd like to see prevented.
But I think the question is, how is protectionism in the US, which is a form of deglobalization, going to make things better? It looks like it's going to make things worse.
I think it will. And essentially, you could say that what Trump is planning may achieve modest successes in the next 2 or 3 years, but will be disastrous in the long term. Basically, it's a reaction against a perception of too great a difference and elitism, but in fact, the nature of the reaction ultimately will actually make it worse. And that means we do have a problem with the election of Donald Trump, both in that regard and also in regard to climate change. It was just announced last night. They intend to stop all funding of NASA in climate research. And NASA is one of the most important components of the worldwide climate research program. We have a big problem. And it's a rough time, but at the same time, we have to accept somehow we have to rise above that. And it may take some years. I think if we haven't done it really in a major way by 2025, 2030, then it's going to be very much more difficult to turn it around.
When I recovered from the election of Donald Trump, I went on social media to see what the reaction had been on the African continent. And it was quite funny because it wasn't as a shock as it was in this part of the world, but almost everyone was joking about how, now the Americans are going to see exactly what third world politics are about. And I think there is more to that joke. I think that I'm not the first one to think that Trump is going to third worldize America. I think some people, even scholars of politics, have spoken about this. But what I'm going to say actually differs from what many people see. I am Rwandan after all, so I believe in the resilience of the people. I don't think that the world is going to crumble tomorrow. I think people, when they're faced with the biggest challenges, they always choose to rise. There is no any other way. There is no other alternative out there. So if it gets really, and it will, if it gets really, really bad, maybe we will recover some sort of paradigm, new paradigm of thinking. But what I want to get to is, I think this whole alt-right, which is a word I do not endorse and I don't like to use it, I think it's just pure racism that's being given space in public discourse. I think that the rise of these ideas still has to be taken very seriously. I think students of politics have to look into this. But I also think that we shouldn't be so wrapped up. Yes, America is such a powerful country. It's a world leader. But there is, outside of America, billions, and I mean billions really, of people who still live a life that is completely un-American. And, well, maybe the decisions and the global, the decisions that affect us may be being made in New York. But the margins that Paul is talking about, and the change that we are going to see, is not going to come from there. It's going to come from Jakarta and Johannesburg and all of these other places. And these rises will give, and I wish I could have a ball to say that they will be non-violent. They probably will be violence, but I don't think it's, I don't think we're stuck. If you see what I mean, I don't think that we're stuck in this place where we don't know what to do. I think that the movements are happening. They're just not happening where our specific eyes are focused. I can say this because I've seen The Economist, for example, published an article about 4 or 5 years ago. The cover was Africa Rising. There is no question that many of these countries, even with the challenges of conflicts and non-ending ethnic wars, African countries have realized so much progress over the last 10, 15 years. So, yes, we are going through all of this, and yes, the inequality is widening, but I also think that there is another movement that is rising within most nations, and that we haven't really quite figured out how that matches what we see today, but it's not a vacuum. It's far from being a vacuum. And perhaps as we study all of this politics, we as political scientists anyway, we should be able to bridge the gaps between what we think is happening and what actually happens. You know, how we saw Hillary Clinton becoming the first female president, and she didn't. So there's something that we probably are not seeing. And maybe we should be a little bit humble in analyzing the people.
Yeah, Justine.
I think it's a really good question. I think I would say that this transition that humanity has the opportunity to move into, or has the necessity to move into, could have looked very different. And I think if you rewind, 10 years ago, there was potential and there was opportunity for us to make these changes in a peaceful way. And I think for me, the climate change talks in 2009 in Copenhagen were like a real turning point. That was where the leaders of our planet said, we don't care, we're not taking responsibility for this. And so from my point of view, that moment onwards, we've been living in a different reality and we've been taking the hard route through that transition. And my sense is there will be a lot of destruction and there will be a lot of darkness and disintegration coming our way. But as Alice said, all the way across the world, this other movement of thinking is there and it's rising, it's present. And if you look at what's happened in Greece since the stock market crash, a huge amount of economic activity, new economic activity has come out of that that's really re-engineered social relationships and has been, there's some amazing stuff going on there. So it's like when we could have shifted the collective, in a peaceful way, now we're down to actually living in two worlds. There's the sort of old paradigm that's disintegrating around us and creating this darkness and this horrible territory, which is only going to get worse. And then in among that, there is this movement rising up from the ground of a different way of thinking and a different way of doing things. And I know in my work at St. Ethelburgers, I was very focused on creating that collective shift in thinking for 10 years. The first 10 years I was at St. Ethelburgers, and now I don't bother with that. What I look at is how to nurture and empower the younger generation to bring that new thinking through in grassroots initiatives, because when the rest of the world collapses, those initiatives will survive. And if those initiatives are linked together in a certain way, then, something of the new can be born. But I think we're facing essentially a dark age.
Is it? Well, that sounds really bad.
It does, doesn't it?
Right, so when you talk about Copenhagen, I think of Paris.
Uh-huh.
And you talk of darkness, and I think of, well, actually, as Paul said, the amount of violence in the world seems to be going down. It went down in an era of free trade. I can't see it getting any better in an era of protectionism, which is actually much worse. Mm-hmm. And so the talk about deglobalization seems to be a threat rather than a great opportunity. Mm. So anyway, other questions? Right at the back there.
Thanks. Excuse me. Tim Cribb, this college. So much of this comes back, as Bill Clinton said, to the economy is stupid, and the economy being global is no respecter of nationalisms. Could I invite the panel to conduct a thought experiment? When Europe was rebuilt after the war, mainly through the Marshall Plan, it was rebuilt on the old, that was then the current and dominant economic model. Imagine rebuilding it now with what we know now and what we can see, what we need now. How would Europe have been rebuilt if we were doing it now, in the light of all the things you've been saying?
I'll give Paul first go at this.
Okay.
Impossible question.
I don't think I can answer it directly. What I can answer indirectly is the kind of work that is going on now in our current circumstances. I think the most interesting work that's been done in Britain is the work that the New Economics Foundation has done on what it calls the Great Transition Project. And one of the key underpinnings of that is developing an econometric model which looks at the British economy and feeds in things like the requirement for greater equity and the requirement for low-carbon developments. It actually models the economy and looks at the means by which government and others, using fiscal and other means, can direct the economy to an extent in different directions. And it's a pretty sophisticated model which is getting taken seriously by mainstream economists now. That is an indication of the kind of thinking which is looking ahead. There's similar work going on in Sweden, in Germany, in Canada, and elsewhere. And as I say, there's some, as Alice was saying, some very interesting work going on in the Global South. I'd hesitate to try and respond on your historic question, but what I can say is there is a lot of good work going on in terms of what can be done. And on the issue of dark ages, yes, I think we do face a great difficulty. But on the other hand, I mean, one has to, have the resilience to face up to it. I've worked for the last 40 years, firstly about a decade on nuclear issues, and then the last 30 years on issues of political violence and the rise of paramilitary movements. In those circumstances, you end up with three choices. You're suicidal, you're alcoholic, and I didn't drink too much last night, or you're optimistic. And essentially, I think I would come down on the third.
Of course, Corelli Barnett of this college would say that the problem was that the rebuilding after the Second World War was it was rebuilt on that theory, on the theory of the state directing the economy, and that was part of the problem. Anyway,
I think the previous two speakers have given a great answer to that, and it is a slightly impossible question. But I think I would just qualify what I said about a dark age. It doesn't mean I'm not optimistic, and it doesn't mean I don't have resilience. It's like, and I think there is a way in which, for example, the election of Donald Trump in my networks generated a huge surge of kind of, a response that was coming from a place of love and like, we're going to organise and we're going to live our passion and we're going to bring that new reality into existence. And I think, we can dig deep into ourselves and find resources within us when we face crisis that we can't when everything's cool. So I'm kind of up for living in a dark age.
Yeah, Alice. Okay. I think we probably have time for one more, possibly two. So right at the back, the other side of the camera. So this might be an anonymous question when it comes out.
Ed Minoan, I'm a serving officer in the British Army. This question is really directed towards Dr. Huxley. I'm very interested in the fact you talked about how we need to move away from sort of binary options. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but you said, having binary options doesn't really work. And you gave the example of Donald Trump and Brexit. So it seems to me that what you're suggesting is that we sort of either refuse to accept or ignore the vote of half the population of the UK and millions of Americans based on potentially a sort of a liberal narrative, whether right or wrong. What I'm interested in sort of looking at is, or sort of what I'd really like you to sort of to build on and to sort of explain more is, if these binary options, as you say, come from a line of, well, what were effectively multiple options. So it wasn't just Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton. There were lots and lots of options all the way through. If we do refuse to accept that, it seems to me that actually that doesn't cause peace, that doesn't sort of reduce conflict, it creates more conflict, far, far more conflict. To say, no, Donald Trump, not my president. Look at what you've got now. You've got crisis, you've got, almost like a moral uprising, good or bad thing. But it doesn't seem to me, in my mind, that reduces conflict in any way, to refuse binary options.
Yeah, that's a really great question. Thank you for asking it. I think it's, the way I see it, that shift from binary thinking to interdependent thinking is very present in the world of new economics and in the world of ecological initiatives. But the political world is really lagging behind that. And I think so it's difficult to make that criticism when you can't actually offer an alternative. But my sense is that it's to do with participation on a much broader scale. So I think, firstly, it's also important to note that it isn't half the population. It was a quarter of the population that voted to leave, if you also take into account the people who couldn't vote or the people who weren't eligible to vote. So it's like less than a quarter. But if you use participatory dialogue techniques that consult, and engage all of the diversity, within a particular system, you can generate much more innovative responses. That's the kind of systems thinking framework. But how that looks for the political system, I honestly don't know. But I do know that you can bring a group of very diverse perspectives into a room and you can create a polarized debate which will force a choice between this and that actually generates division and it limits creativity. Whereas there are lots of emerging models out there where you can engage all of the diversity in that room, and what it does is it harnesses the collective intelligence of the system and generates really innovative solutions. So beyond, does that answer your question, or am I just...
So it seems like you're putting the cart before the horse then, because what you're saying is that we can't, yes, it is sort of dangerous, but we need to sort of think about this thing, but it doesn't, the system we've got doesn't apply to politics. Yeah.
I'm not saying it doesn't apply. Yeah.
How we're going to have that binary system, we still need to have it.
Yeah, that's basically what I'm saying, yeah. I'm not sure it's putting the cart before the horse, but I am basically saying this is the worldview and this is the methodology which is emerging in this social movement around the world, and the political system is not taking that shift on board with the same speed as other disciplines are. So I don't know if anyone else on the panel has a response to that.
Horses and carts, binary system. Alice.
I don't know if this will add any clarification to your question, but I've lived now in the West for a decade and a few years, and there is something that I've observed, and there is an aversion to conflict in Western ways of life. I think the British have mastered that one quite well, but I think it's quite a social fact, and so I think it gets sort of transferred into also politics. So when people are given those binary choices, they are there, but then what do we do after that? If you ask people to vote, and this is one of my beef with elections and the sort, if you ask people to vote between two people, you should be able to actually say what's going to happen when they go with plan A and when they go with plan B. And you should probably launch a dialogue and a discussion about what happens afterwards before it happens. Why am I saying this? The West is, I'm sorry when I say this because it might come out the wrong way, it's throwing a fit because of a system that it invented. This is not some sort of Eastern Oriental inventions. This is democracy in the purest Western way. So we can throw a fit about how Donald Trump came to power. We can really be annoyed about what happened with Brexit. But then what? Perhaps the right way to approach this is to, and I see the problem with binary, and I see what you're saying as, so if there is no binary, then what do we do? And I want to go back not so much to the choice itself, but to how you deal with conflict and friction when the choice that's made is not the choice that you wanted. Now, for those of us who were born and grew up in places where we don't get to make decisions, this is something we've dealt with for the last 100 years. Things happen, people show up at your doorstep and they colonize you for hundreds of years, and you don't actually have anything to say about it. But the West doesn't have that predisposition to accepting things even when they don't go their way, which is probably why it takes so much time and so much anger, but also psychological analysis before something changes. So I think that I want to feel sympathy for what's happening now in Western politics, but I don't know if I can get to that point in my guts. I think it just says, no, you make this. I mean, we should have asked Plato what he thought was going to happen when democracy was the rule of the majority, and the majority was actually not smart, or not necessarily what we think is smart. Why do we even think that people who voted for Trump are actually wrong? How do we come with that? Perhaps they're channeling other grievances that we may not be able to understand or even subscribe to, but they are the majority, and it's a system we came up with. So, no, not we came up with, I wasn't there, but they came up with. So I don't know. I mean, I understand the feat, and I keep hearing about this Brexit, but I think at some point one has to accept what is there, and perhaps rethink. I don't know. Maybe if there had been any colonization in these parts of the world, it would feel different. I don't know.
Oddly, of course, the people who voted Trump weren't the majority. Finally, Paul, eschatology is pretty binary.
It is indeed, yes, which adds to the complication. I don't think, honestly, I'd like to add anything to what Alice and Justina said in answer to that. But just to reflect that we are in those proverbial very interesting times. I think there's huge potential for new thinking. I think we're going to be forced to do the new thinking. Better that we do it with good sense and optimism. And in some ways, I wish I was 50 years younger, but never mind, you can't win everything, can you?
Yeah, don't we all? Well, those are that kind of age. Well, that's it for this session, which I think has been enormously stimulating and challenging. And I hope you enjoyed it, but I hope it also made you think. And I hope you'll join me with thanking our speakers.